Bow with me, please. God, Father Almighty, worthy of all of our praise, creator of the heavens and the earth and all within it. God, I thank you so much for providing such a wonderful way for us to be reunited with you by our simple faith and belief and obedience, God. Thank you for your Son and his sacrifice and how much it means to us. And I just pray we wake up every day taking up our cross to follow his lead. God, thank you so much for this time of study. Thank you for Jack, and I just pray that whatever he has prepared is fit to go straight to our hearts, God, that we would learn and understand a little bit more about the scriptures because of it. Thank you for your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Sean. We'll be turning in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes 10. Ecclesiastes 10 is where we are going to be this morning. And we looked at chapter 9 and into chapter 10 last week, and so we're picking back up with chapter 10. And there are three sets of proverbs in the second half of this chapter that all seem to go together. As far as each set is its own set, and they go together. But I want to look back up there in verses 5 through 7 to kind of set it up as we get into this new section, where Solomon writes, "There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves." So we discussed this last week and saw how there are things that we look at in the world that don't seem to make sense. Things that should be one way, and in fact, they're actually another. And we also related this to what Solomon said earlier, that time and chance happen to everyone, essentially. And that's something that we have to keep in mind, that we are going to look out into the world, and we're going to look at something and say, well, that's not how it should be. And we shouldn't look at it from a perspective of how we think it should be or how the world says it should be, but we look at it from the perspective of, but that's not how it should be according to God. That doesn't make any sense. Why is it like that? And I think that's one of the mysteries that we are going to continue to wrestle with and struggle with and have to essentially deal with, is that there are going to be things that we see that do not make sense. The world is going to seem like it is totally flipped upside down. And the question that we're going to struggle is, why has God allowed it to be so? Why has God allowed it to be so? That's the question that Job struggled with. That's what he wrestled through with he and his friends, those who were supposed to be comforting him, but were actually trying to bring judgment upon him. And we're going to be wrestling with the same question. And that's going to be one of the mysteries that we struggle with. We are not always going to know why God has allowed it to be so. It doesn't necessarily mean that God has instituted that. It doesn't mean that God has caused that in some cases, but that God has allowed it to take place. And not only are we going to struggle with this mystery, but the world continues to struggle with these mysteries. No matter how much the world tries to set itself in order, no matter how much the world tries to set up its own system and its own standards, the world has got to deal with things as well. It just so happens, and this is just from my perspective, I think that there are more questions that are answered within Christianity and with God being where he is than there is with there no God at all. And so here, going into verses 8 through 11, Solomon has this first set of proverbs on the back half of this chapter And it's something that we would all do well to pay attention to and to take heed of. We'll read those verses and then discuss them, where he says, "He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer." All of these could be summed up with what Solomon says there at the end of verse 10. Wisdom helps one to succeed. And he gives different scenarios here of different things, common trades, I suppose. And as far as the last one in verse 11, that has always been a dream job of mine, wanting to be a snake charmer in a carnival or somewhere. I think I might be getting my start late in life, but you know what? You got to start somewhere. But in all of these things, we have to keep the end of verse 10 in view. Wisdom helps one to succeed. And we could say not only, of course, is this the theme of the entire book of Ecclesiastes, but this is going to be the key to interpreting much of what Solomon is going to say in these three sets of Proverbs. And you just take these one by one. Look at verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it. Well, what's the obvious danger of digging a pit? And you think about the depth of which you are digging, but you also think about all of the other dangers that could be around you. If you're digging a hole, the chance it greatly increases that you're going to fall into that hole. That's just the risk that you take. A serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. Unless you are 100% certain of what is on the other side of a wall, isn't it best to proceed with caution? You don't know what's on the other side of that wall. And so just to go and frivolously and carefreely break down a wall, if you don't know what's on the other side of it, there could be anything on the other side of it. Let your imagination run wild with what's on the other side of that wall. If it causes us to take pause and to take caution and to really begin to think about, okay, if it has to be done, let it be done in a wise manner. Let us all take caution and do it the way that it's supposed to be, so that if there is something on the other side of that wall, that we don't get harmed by it. Verse 9, he who quarries stones is hurt by them. Well, I haven't seen too many rock quarries in my life, but I do know that working with anything, especially working with stones, there is the chance, just like digging the pit, there's a chance that you're going to be harmed by them. I haven't seen too many rock quarries in my life, but I have heard countless stories of people who have not just been injured, but who have lost their lives in rock quarries. He who splits logs is endangered by them. And they may have had fewer options when this was written as to how they split logs. But you think about all of the many different ways that logs are split today. In fact, I had when I was with Charlie one day, he was showing me his whole outfit, and many of you have seen that at his property. All of the woodworking that he does. And just by looking at his property, the risk of your life is increased greatly, or the risk towards your life is increased greatly. Charlie works with some amazing things and does some amazing things with those, but he understands a lot of the safety measures that have to be in place. He's going to let you know the safety measures that are in place. But anybody who takes on any of these things understands that there must be a risk, and that's living life wisely. First of all, understanding that there's a risk involved. You just look there in verse 10. Again, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. You think about how we live so unwisely and the additional strength that we are using up that we otherwise wouldn't have to if we took the proper measures and took the proper precautions. And there in verse 11, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The whole point of charming a snake, and just to use the illustration, the whole point of charming a snake is to put it in a trance so that it doesn't bite you. But what good is doing that if it's already bitten you before you've even started? Understanding that there is a risk involved. And so wisdom helps one to succeed. Wisdom is going to help you not fall into the pit. It's going to help you gauge the risk before breaking down the wall. It's going to help you not to be hurt or endangered by stones or logs. It is going to help you reserve and keep the strength that you need instead of working tirelessly because you haven't taken the measures to take care of the things that are going to help you along, such as sharpening the iron. It's going to make sure that you understand that you need to charm the snake before it has an opportunity to do any harm to you. Otherwise, you are going to have no advantage. Any questions or comments? Let's look at verses 12 through 15. And these are going to follow some of the patterns and some of the topics that we are probably more familiar with when it comes to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is all about wise living versus foolish living. And Solomon takes great pains to let us know the difference between the two. But then also in the general Proverbs, once you get to chapter 10 of Proverbs through the rest of the chapter, the general Proverbs even bring up these recurring themes over and over again. In verse 12 through 15, Solomon says, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Now, a lot of this is, as we have seen, Solomon talks about the way of the fool more than he talks about the way of the wise man. But I think that sometimes, and Solomon certainly does this, sometimes we don't need to hear all of the benefits of being wise. Sometimes that just takes a few, and maybe just one benefit of being wise. Sometimes you can get your point across by showing all of the detriments of being a fool. Solomon has done this too. He's talked about a little bit of wisdom can go a long way, and we talked about that, and a little bit of folly can go a long way. Well, it's not just that. It is also that sometimes we can compound all of the many ways being foolish can be a detriment to us. And so all he says there is that the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor. That's the only thing in this section that he has said is a benefit to being wise. But you think about what a benefit that is. Being wise to be able to, and just to take words of the mouth, for instance, to be able to know and to think about conversations that you have with other people, to show them the wisdom that you have, not just to gain favor, but as Solomon has said, because living wisely is the better way to live. And even better still, living wisely according to God's wisdom. The lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. There is nothing good that comes from the words of a fool. Nothing. In fact, they just continue to compound themselves. The more a foolish person talks, the more, and he doesn't even realize it, the more he is consumed by the words of his mouth. They turn around just like if he was constructing or creating a serpent from his words. Eventually they turn around and they bite him. In verses 14 and 15 are really important to this. And we've seen this proverb many times in the book of Proverbs. A fool multiplies words. A fool just keeps talking. He doesn't have wisdom enough to know when to stop. And he continues on and on and on. Before he knows it, and before we know it, because a lot of times wise people can be the victims of foolish people, before anybody knows it, he's saying things that he can't be sure of. It's all about two, and you think about it, this may be a little bit closer to us and what we sometimes do, the whole making promises that you can't keep. Saying things as certain that you were completely uncertain of. And that's what gets people, and especially us, if we are not careful, that's what gets us in a lot of trouble. There's no way that we can keep some of the promises that we make. And yet we promise it anyway, not thinking about it, not taking the time to use and employ wisdom in our words to be able to make sure that we do not say something or go too far in saying something that we will regret later, and that will also be the detriment and the hurt of somebody else. And so that's why he says there, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? A wise person knows that there are limitations. There are limitations to what we are able to do, and there are limitations to what we are able to know. We don't know what's going to come tomorrow. The New Testament continually reminds us of this. We don't know what tomorrow holds. And why would we be, as James would say, why would we be so arrogant as to think that we do? And Solomon, again and again, in the book of Ecclesiastes, has reminded us of this. Because we don't know what tomorrow holds, isn't it best, just like in that group of Proverbs beforehand, isn't it best to proceed with caution? Isn't it best to say we don't know what tomorrow holds? Kind of like breaking down the wall. I don't know what's on the other side of that wall. I don't know what tomorrow holds. And so it's best to be careful about going into it, lest we fall into the pit, the serpent bites, or we are harmed or endangered by something that we are working with, something that should work to our advantage, but because of our lack of wisdom doesn't. In verse 15, he says, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Although our roads are a little bit better than the roads in ancient times, I intentionally held back. That's a large exaggeration. They are much better. It's easy. It was easy to find the way to the city back then. You know that expression, all roads lead to Rome? That expression, it's easy to find the way to the city today. It was easy to find it then. And that's how foolish somebody actually is. That they, if we want to think about it, they're walking themselves in a circle. They are so foolish and without wisdom that they can't even find their way to the city. And if we want to take the expression even further, even the most foolish person should be able to find their way to the city, and they can't. And they weary themselves because of their lack of wisdom. If you can't even find your way to the city, if you can't even find yourself getting there as everybody else can, what does that truly say about you? Well, we're like Wile E. Coyote. We're out in the middle of thin air, and maybe we are still spinning our legs, trying to get to some place that we don't have the footing to get to. That's what a life without wisdom, that's what it does. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We don't like to admit our own ignorance. I've said this time and again, ignorance in some cases is not a bad thing. But our arrogance gets to us to where we think that our ignorance on something is a bad thing, that we're going to be embarrassed by it. And so it is acting foolishly. If we don't know where we're going, it's acting foolishly not to ask of those who do know the way. But either we continue in our arrogance, and sometimes people are just so blinded by foolishness that they've lost the ability to seek wisdom. That some people are so lost in their foolishness and in their ignorance that they're so blind that there's no way that they can see their way back. Yes.
And wouldn't this be applicable to us when we're doing stupid things? To keep on doing those stupid things?
Sure, absolutely.
Learn from our mistakes.
Well, we see an example of that going to Romans 1. We see the example of that people are so satisfied in living in their rebellion and living in the desires of their heart that God gives them over to it. God allows them to follow down that path and to go deeper and deeper into it. And pretty soon I don't like going in caves. And so I'm comfortable going as far into a cave as I can turn around and still see the entrance. But what happens is that people go further and further into the cave to where eventually it's pitch black. And unless they're skilled, they lose their way and they can't hope to find their way back. So as long as that sunlight is still there, as long as I can see that, I know that I'm safe until I can't see it anymore, and then I know I'm in trouble. So yeah, I think it's still applicable.
You know, miners, wouldn't the job of mining go back to all of those previous things about
Sure.
the stones falling out of the cave? I couldn't be a miner.
And that's one of those, if you want to think of it this way, and I don't mean to say that it's evil, but it's one of those necessary evils. I think, it has to be done, conditions for it. I could be wrong about this. I think that we have now developed better ways of doing that job than have been in the past. But there's still so many jobs around the world that incur so much risk. And you have to understand the risk. And a lot of accidents happen because people have been careless. They haven't used wisdom. And it's unfortunate because wise people can be caught in the crossfire of that. So, yeah, absolutely. Any others? Yes, Robert.
I did an extreme case that happened years ago. Many people here are familiar with Beaver Storm, States Field, right near Abilene Building.
Mm-hmm.
Some two ladies who came to the store and asked if Charlottesville was nearby. And we're talking Charlottesville, Virginia.
Virginia, right.
They did not realize they were in North Carolina. But they asked where they're from, Ohio. So they went.
Wow.
Somehow they went all the way through Western Virginia to North Carolina. Michigan. And this is hours and hours on the road.
Right.
And I think that my father-in-law was asking, going to show where it was on the map. Probably they couldn't read the map.
Mm-hmm.
And these are adult young women. And then he said, well, when they leave the parking lot, we go west, and then you come down here on 77th. And they left that parking lot and then went east. So we figured eventually they would get to Charlottesville, but they'd have to cross the Atlantic, Europe and Asia, and then cross over to Alaska and down on down. And probably a year later, end up a bigger storm on Charlottesville.
Yeah.
But the sad thing about this is, people may look at this and say, well, that's typical of Christians and religious people. We're making fun of people who do not have mental capacity, and that's not the case.
Right.
And I think we all understand that. It's talking about people who will not avail themselves
Right.
of wisdom and education so they become fools by their own action, not because there's something wrong with it.
I think that's a good distinction too, and yeah, we're not talking about people with any sort of mental deficiency. In fact, we can be talking about some of the smartest people in the world, who can. And going back to the poor wise man in the city that Solomon told about up in chapter 9. You don't have to be the smartest in the world to be wise and to live wisely and to make smart choices. Because a lot of the smartest people in the world make some of the dumbest choices, and like to show off how smart they are. And again, this is I'm saying this generally, but we can't say that this is a generalization about everybody. So yeah, we're not when we talk about wise and foolish, we're not talking about people with any sort of mental deficiency. We're talking about those who could and choose not to. Anyone else?
Sometimes people ignore what should be intuitively obvious, even the most casual.
There's, just to use a minor example of that too, you can be looking at the same thing or watching the same thing, and somebody notices something that the other doesn't. And that's why it's so good. Solomon has talked about it, and many other times in Scripture it's talked about, where that's why it's good to go through life with someone. You're going to be able to compliment one another. And I don't mean compliment as saying, well, you've done a good job today and you have too. Compliment with an E. You complement one another, whereas if there's a deficiency in one, the other makes up for it, and vice versa. And you help one another along, and you both get stronger together. So yeah, I think that it could be like that, whereas one can be good. Nobody said that there's anything wrong with being just one, but if there's two or three, well, that's better in a lot of cases.
Isn't that called different perspectives?
It can be, yeah. I think that sometimes different perspectives can be, you're looking at the same thing, and one thinks of it one way and one thinks of it the other, and each one are neither right or wrong. I think so, but I think that there are some things that you look at, and like I love mysteries. I love crime shows, mysteries being solved, and things like that. With mysteries being solved, there are things that you have to find, and there are things that point directly to something else, and it puts the puzzle together. And I think that in some cases, one may not see it, but the other does see it, and that's pertinent information. So yeah, I think that it goes both ways. Difference in perspective. Anyone else?
I
And I think that you're right on that. I think that there is things that are obvious, and yes, and I think that we do have to be careful because there's some things that we may consider to be common sense that may actually not be. It's because it's been the years of experience that we've been living that we've accumulated that, and we look at somebody, well, you should know that. Well, maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. So, but I think that you're right on a lot of that. I did want to say one thing before our time runs out with this. I said earlier that one of the things that Solomon is saying here is to live cautiously. Let me add a caveat to that. Let me take it a bit further, because I think one of the important things that Solomon has been pointing to throughout this letter, and we'll finally get to it in chapter 12, is to live faithfully. Living faithfully to God and having faith in Him, trusting Him, because we are not always going to live wisely. We are still going to do foolish things. Maybe we learn from those foolish things and we accumulate wisdom because of it. Maybe our ignorance, maybe we're still blind to the point to where it's going to take additional chiseling away at our ignorance or our hard hearts to get us to open our eyes. But the important thing is that we live faithfully to God. And we now know, because of revelation, because of what God has done, that Jesus Christ is the pinnacle of God's wisdom. Because looking at those things, just because we use wisdom not to fall into the pit, doesn't mean that we won't fall into the pit. Being wise around the pit brings our chances down. There's still a chance. And so no matter what we find happening to us, we could live the wisest life in the world and still be wrought with difficulty and obstacles and all of these things. The wisest way to live in the world is to live faithfully to God each day. That no matter what we encounter, we know that God is going to take care of us. Yes, Tony.
Nature of our human existence is we cannot foresee the circumstances of all of our actions. No matter how smart or educated we are, life is full of unintended consequences. We don't foresee them.
Yeah.
It says, Solomon said earlier in chapter 9 that time and chance happen to us all. And so the only constant we have is God.
Yep. And isn't that the one that we have been told to come to? And especially in Matthew chapter 11, come to me. Jesus says, come to me. Despite our circumstances, if we continue to walk toward Him and with Him, whatever life circumstances, we know will be taken care of. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I apologize about the late start again, but we will be picking up and going into chapter 11 next week. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.